In 1872, the United States government did something no country in human history had ever done before. They took a massive piece of land in the territory of Wyoming, drew a fence around it, and declared that no one could ever own it, build on it, or develop it. They called it Yellowstone. They called it America's first national park. And the official story they told the public was beautiful. It was about preserving nature for future generations, about protecting the wilderness from greedy industrialists, about the noble American spirit recognizing that some things are more important than money. But here's the thing nobody talks about. The men who pushed for Yellowstone weren't naturalists. They weren't environmentalists. There wasn't even a word for environmentalism yet. The men who pushed for Yellowstone were railroad executives. Specifically, they worked for the Northern Pacific Railroad, and they had been trying for years to figure out how to get Americans to ride their trains across an empty stretch of country that nobody wanted to visit. Yellowstone wasn't created to protect nature from capitalism. Yellowstone was created because capitalism needed something to sell. And once you understand that, the entire story of America's national parks looks completely different. If you want to keep getting videos that pull back the curtain on the stories you were told in school, hit subscribe right now. We're going deep on this one. And by the end, you're going to see your next family road trip in a way you never have before. To understand why the railroads needed Yellowstone, you have to go back to 1869. That's the year the Transcontinental Railroad was finally completed. The Golden Spike was driven into the ground at Promontory Summit, Utah. Champagne was poured, speeches were made. And for the first time in human history, you could travel from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean in less than a week. It was supposed to be the moment America truly became one country. But there was a problem. A massive, expensive, unsolvable problem. The railroad ran through nothing. For thousands of miles between Omaha and Sacramento, the train passed through territory that almost nobody lived in. There were no major cities, there were no industries, there were no farms producing goods that needed to be shipped. The railroad companies had spent the modern equivalent of tens of billions of dollars laying track across an empty continent. And now they had to figure out how to make that track profitable. The Northern Pacific had its hands full. Their proposed route ran through Minnesota, the Dakotas, Montana, and the Pacific Northwest. And in 1870, almost none of that territory was settled by white Americans. The Northern Pacific was about to spend a fortune building a railroad to the middle of nowhere, with no obvious customers, no obvious freight, and no obvious reason for anyone to ever ride it. The man who had to solve this problem was named Jay Cooke. He was a financier from Philadelphia who had made his fortune selling government bonds during the Civil War. In 1870, he agreed to finance the entire Northern Pacific Railroad. He bet his fortune, his reputation, and his bank on it. He needed the Northern Pacific to succeed because if it failed, he would lose everything. And to make it succeed, he needed something on that route that Americans would want to see. That's where Yellowstone came in. For decades, mountain men and trappers had been coming back from the Yellowstone region with stories that sounded insane. They talked about geysers that shot boiling water hundreds of feet into the air. They talked about pools of water that were every color of the rainbow. They talked about mud that bubbled like soup, about waterfalls taller than any in the eastern United States, about a canyon painted yellow and gold and red. Nobody believed them. The stories sounded like tall tales, like the kind of thing fur trappers made up after spending too many winters alone in the wilderness. But in 1869 and 1870, two official expeditions confirmed that the stories were true. The Cook-Folsom-Peterson expedition went into the Yellowstone region and reported back that everything the trappers had said was real. A year later, a much larger expedition led by Henry Washburn went deeper into the territory and brought back even more confirmations. They were professional surveyors. Their accounts were taken seriously, and word started to spread that there was a place in the American West that looked like nothing else on Earth. Jay Cooke was paying attention. The Northern Pacific Railroad's planned route ran within 50 miles of this strange wonderland, and Cooke realized something that nobody else had quite put together yet. If Yellowstone became a destination, and if the only practical way to get there was on his railroad, then his railroad would have something it desperately needed: a reason to exist. But there was a complication. Under the homestead laws and the mining laws and the general approach to public land in the United States at that time, Yellowstone could be claimed, settled, mined, logged, and divided up by private owners. If that happened, the entire region would become a chaotic patchwork of private property. Some of it would be tourist traps run by hucksters. Some of it would be mines and lumber operations that destroyed the very features that made it interesting. There would be no way to control the experience. There would be no way to guarantee that visitors who took the long train ride west would actually find something worth seeing when they arrived. The geysers would be fenced off behind paid admission. The waterfalls would be polluted by mining operations. The whole spectacle would be ruined by uncoordinated private development. Cook needed a different solution. He needed the federal government to take Yellowstone off the market entirely. He needed it preserved, but not for the sake of nature. He needed it preserved as a permanent, protected, free public attraction that his railroad could deliver tourists to. The federal government would maintain the spectacle. His railroad would charge for the access. It was a beautiful piece of corporate strategy disguised as public-spirited generosity. Cook hired a lobbyist named A.B. Nettleton to push the idea in Washington. He funded a magazine writer named Nathaniel Langford to give public lectures about Yellowstone's wonders. Langford gave a famous lecture in Washington, D.C. in January 1871 that was attended by congressmen and senators, and the lecture was paid for by the Northern Pacific Railroad. Cook also funded a major scientific expedition into Yellowstone, led by a geologist named Ferdinand Hayden, that brought back the first photographs and paintings of the region. Those photographs and paintings were then displayed in the United States Capitol. The photographs were taken by a man named William Henry Jackson, who hauled hundreds of pounds of glass plates and chemicals into the wilderness on the back of a mule. The paintings were created by a young artist named Thomas Moran, whose entire trip was paid for directly by Jay Cook and the Northern Pacific Railroad. Moran had never even seen the American West before. Cook specifically recruited him because he had a romantic, dramatic style that would make the geysers look like something out of a fairy tale. And it worked. Moran's painting of the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone became the single most influential image in the entire Yellowstone campaign. Congress bought the original for $10,000 and hung it in the Senate lobby. Lawmakers walked past it every day on their way to vote on the bill that would create the park. It would be hard to imagine a more direct example of corporate art commissioning shaping public policy. The Northern Pacific paid an artist to paint a picture. The picture was put in front of Congress, and Congress voted to protect the land in the picture. The whole thing was a coordinated influence campaign that ran for almost 2 years before the bill was even written. By the time the bill creating Yellowstone National Park was introduced in Congress in late 1871, the groundwork had been laid for years. And the bill passed quickly, with very little opposition, because nobody in Congress understood what they were actually doing. They thought they were protecting a curiosity, a weird patch of geysers in a territory that nobody could imagine ever being valuable. Setting it aside cost them nothing because the land had no obvious commercial use. Why not preserve it? President Ulysses S. Grant signed the Yellowstone National Park Protection Act on March 1st, 1872. The official language of the bill said the land was being preserved as a public park for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. There was not one word in the bill about the Northern Pacific Railroad. There was not one mention of Jay Cook. The corporate strategy that had created the park was completely invisible in the official record, and that's how it has stayed. Now here's where the story gets darker. 6 months after the park was created, the Northern Pacific Railroad started running into financial trouble. Construction was more expensive than expected. Bond sales weren't bringing in enough money. Cook's bank was overextended, and in September 1873, Jay Cook and Company collapsed. The failure of Cook's bank triggered a chain reaction that became known as the Panic of 1873, which was the worst economic depression in American history up to that point. Banks across the country failed. Tens of thousands of businesses went under. Unemployment hit 25% in some cities. The Northern Pacific Railroad was bankrupt. Construction stopped. The line into Yellowstone country wouldn't be completed for another 10 years, but Yellowstone itself remained protected. Even as Cook went broke, even as his railroad project stalled, the federal government continued to hold the park off the market. By the time the Northern Pacific finally reached Montana in 1883 under new ownership, Yellowstone was still there waiting. And now there was a luxury hotel being built at Mammoth Hot Springs, designed to receive tourists who would arrive by train. The Northern Pacific even printed elaborate marketing brochures and posters celebrating Yellowstone as a destination, decades before any other railroad figured out how to do this. They invented modern tourism marketing. And here's the part that should make every American think twice. The model worked. It worked so well that other railroads started doing the same thing. The Great Northern Railway pushed for the creation of Glacier National Park in Montana in 1910. The Santa Fe Railway pushed for the development of Grand Canyon as a national monument in 1908 and then as a national park in 1919. The Southern Pacific Railroad pushed for Yosemite to be transferred from California state control to federal control as a national park, which happened in 1906. Sequoia, Kings Canyon, Crater Lake, Mount Rainier. Every single one of the early western national parks was created with the active financial and political support of a major railroad company. And in every single case, that railroad company built a luxury hotel at the park, ran exclusive tours into the park, and made enormous profits delivering wealthy tourists to the park. The pattern was so consistent that it had a name inside the railroad industry. They called it the See America First campaign. The idea was simple. American elites had been spending their tourist dollars in Europe for generations. They went to the Alps, they went to the Italian lakes, they went to the Scottish Highlands. The railroads wanted that money to stay in the United States, riding on American trains, sleeping in American hotels, spending in American towns. So they invented a romantic mythology of the American West as a place of sublime natural wonder, the equal of anything Europe had to offer. The national parks were the centerpieces of that mythology. By the 1920s, wealthy Americans were taking train trips to Yellowstone and Glacier and Yosemite the same way their parents had taken steamships to Switzerland. But the people writing American history textbooks left the railroads out of the story. By the time the average American heard about the national parks in a school classroom, the story had been cleaned up into something much simpler and much more flattering. The story they were told was that visionary individuals like John Muir and Theodore Roosevelt fought to protect America's natural heritage from corporate greed. It was a beautiful story. It was also almost the exact opposite of what actually happened. John Muir was a real environmentalist. He genuinely cared about wilderness preservation. But Muir's role in the creation of the national parks has been wildly exaggerated, and the role of the railroads has been almost completely erased. When Muir founded the Sierra Club in 1892, the wealthy donors who funded it included executives from the Southern Pacific Railroad. When Muir lobbied for Yosemite to become a federal park, his main political ally was the Southern Pacific Railroad. The relationship was so close that some of Muir's critics accused him of being a corporate front. Muir himself probably didn't see it that way. He thought he was using the railroads to achieve his goals, but the railroads thought they were using him to achieve theirs. And in the end, both sides got what they wanted. Theodore Roosevelt is an even more interesting case. He gets credit as the great conservationist president, the man who created the national park system as we know it. And it's true that Roosevelt protected an enormous amount of land. But Roosevelt was also a man with deep personal ties to the railroad industry. His political career was funded by railroad money. His administration's conservation policies were shaped in close coordination with railroad executives. The general manager of the Great Northern Railway, Louis Hill, was personally involved in lobbying Roosevelt to create Glacier National Park. And the entire framework Roosevelt used for national park policy, the idea that parks should be developed for tourist access with hotels and roads and concessions, came directly from the railroad industry's vision. This isn't to say Roosevelt was a corporate puppet. He was a complicated man with genuine convictions. But the conservation movement he led wasn't a battle between nature lovers and corporate greed. It was a partnership between certain corporate interests and a particular vision of how Americans should experience their landscape. The vision was tourism. The vision was leisure travel for the upper middle class. The vision was a national landscape that could be sold as an experience. And consider the timing. Roosevelt signed the Antiquities Act in 1906, which gave him the power to designate national monuments without congressional approval. Within 2 years, he had used that power to create Grand Canyon National Monument, Devil's Tower, Petrified Forest, and a dozen other sites. Almost every single one of them was located along a major railroad line. Grand Canyon was on the Santa Fe. Devil's Tower was on the Burlington. Petrified Forest was on the Santa Fe. The pattern is so consistent that historians who actually study railroad archives, rather than nature mythology, have started to argue that the entire Roosevelt conservation legacy should be understood as a railroad-driven program with environmental benefits, rather than an environmental program that happened to benefit the railroads. The benefits flowed in both directions, but the strategic vision came from the rail companies, not the nature writers. John Muir's biographers tend to skip over the railroad money. They focus on his rapturous descriptions of glaciers and his solo treks through the Sierra Nevada. They quote his famous line about how the mountains are calling and he must go. They don't quote the letters he wrote to Edward Harriman, the railroad tycoon who owned the Southern Pacific and the Union Pacific. Harriman gave Muir a private train car. Harriman invited Muir on a luxury cruise to Alaska in 1899 that became the basis for some of Muir's most influential writing. When Muir died in 1914, his estate was managed by people closely connected to the railroad industry. None of this means Muir was a fraud. His love of wilderness was real, but his political effectiveness depended on a sponsorship system that he himself rarely acknowledged in public. And when he died, his eulogies erased that sponsorship completely, replacing it with the image of the lone wilderness prophet that we still recognize today. And the people who paid the price for this vision were the people who already lived on the land. Yellowstone was not empty when it became a national park. The Crow, the Shoshone, the Bannock, the Blackfeet, and other tribes had hunted, gathered, and traveled through that region for thousands of years. They had treaty rights, they had ancestral claims, and when the park was created, those rights and claims were simply erased. The 1872 Yellowstone Act did not consult a single tribal government. The land was declared a federal park, as if no one had ever lived there. When tribes continued to hunt within the park boundaries, as their treaties allowed, the United States Army was sent in to stop them. In 1877, a confrontation between federal forces and the Nez Perce tribe took place partly within Yellowstone during the Nez Perce flight to Canada. Tourists watched it happen. Some of them were killed in the crossfire. The same pattern repeated everywhere. When Glacier National Park was created in 1910, the Blackfeet tribe had a treaty that guaranteed them hunting and timber rights on the land that became the park. The federal government simply ignored the treaty. When the Blackfeet tried to enforce their rights, they were told the park supersedes the treaty. The case dragged through the courts for decades. The Blackfeet never got their land back. In Yosemite, the Ahwahnechee people who had lived in the valley for centuries were forcibly removed in stages between 1851 and 1969. Yes, 1969. The last native village in Yosemite was burned by the National Park Service as recently as the late 1960s. Almost no one in America has heard about that. The railroad companies didn't create these injustices. The injustices came from the federal government's broader policies of removing native peoples from Western land. But the national park system absorbed and codified those injustices and turned them into permanent features of the American landscape. The wilderness experience that tourists paid to enjoy was built on the forced removal of the people who had lived there before. The empty, pristine nature that the railroads sold was empty because someone had emptied it, and the railroads profited from all of it. By 1920, the Northern Pacific was running luxury Pullman cars to Yellowstone every summer, charging the equivalent of thousands of dollars per ticket in modern money. The Great Northern was running its Empire Builder line to Glacier, with stop-offs at the Many Glacier Hotel that the railroad itself owned and operated. The Santa Fe was running its Grand Canyon line to El Tovar, the luxury hotel the Santa Fe built right on the canyon rim. The national park's tourist trade was a major source of profit for the Western railroads for half a century. They made fortunes off of land that the federal government maintained for free. Then came the automobile, and everything changed again. Starting in the 1910s, but accelerating dramatically in the 1920s, ordinary middle-class Americans started owning cars. The car changed the national parks more profoundly than any other event in their history. Suddenly, you didn't need to ride a railroad to visit Yellowstone. You could drive there yourself. You could go on your own schedule. You could stop wherever you wanted. The railroads lost their monopoly on park access. And the federal government, under the leadership of the new National Park Service founded in 1916, started building roads. Lots of roads. The famous park roads we know today, the Going to the Sun Road in Glacier, the Tioga Pass Road in Yosemite, the Grand Loop in Yellowstone, were all built or expanded during this period to accommodate the new automobile tourists. The railroads fought back. They lobbied against road construction. They tried to keep the parks accessible only by rail, but they lost. The American public wanted to drive their own cars to their own parks on their own schedule. And the National Park Service, which had originally been deeply influenced by the railroad model, started shifting toward a different model, a model where the parks belonged to everyone, not just to wealthy train passengers, a model where ordinary working-class Americans could load up the family Ford and see Old Faithful for themselves. This shift democratized the parks. By the 1930s and 1940s, visitation had exploded. The parks were no longer the exclusive playground of the upper middle class. They became part of American family life. The road trip to Yellowstone or the Grand Canyon became a rite of passage, and in the process, the original commercial origin of the park system was forgotten. The railroads had built the parks, but the cars had taken them over, and the new mythology that grew up around the automobile era was a mythology of public ownership, of natural heritage, of the parks belonging to the people. The earlier mythology of railroad luxury and corporate strategy faded into the background. But the underlying logic never went away. The national parks were still being maintained, expanded, and managed in ways that prioritized tourist access over ecological integrity. The roads brought in tens of millions of visitors a year. The hotels and gift shops and gas stations that grew up inside park boundaries were still profit centers, just owned by different companies than the original railroads. The parks were still being treated as products. They were just being marketed to a much bigger and more diverse audience. And here's the deeper truth that this entire history points to. The American National Park System was not created to protect nature from capitalism. It was created as a sophisticated form of capitalism. A capitalism that understood that some assets are more valuable when they're permanent, public, and free to access. A capitalism that understood that nature itself could be turned into a product, as long as you owned the means of delivery. The railroads owned the means of delivery, so they pushed for the parks to be created. They got rich, the parks survived, and eventually the parks outgrew the railroads and became something more genuinely public. But the original logic, the original deal, never disappeared. It just evolved. This is why the parks today are still under constant pressure to expand visitor services, to build more hotels, to add more concessions, to allow more development. Every time you hear about a debate over whether to allow a new lodge in Yellowstone, or a new tram in the Grand Canyon, or new commercial fishing boats in a marine park, you are watching the original Jay Cooke logic at work. The land was set aside, not because it was valuable in itself, but because it was valuable as an attraction. This is also why the parks have always struggled to actually protect the ecosystems inside them. The wildlife management policies in the early national parks were openly designed to maximize what tourists wanted to see. Predators like wolves and mountain lions were exterminated by federal hunters because tourists found them frightening. Bears were fed garbage at open dumps so that visitors could photograph them. Forests were managed to look pretty rather than to function ecologically. Rivers were dammed inside park boundaries to create more scenic lakes. Hetchy Valley in Yosemite was flooded to provide water to San Francisco, even though the park was supposedly inviolable. The parks were never really about nature. They were about a particular vision of what nature should look like for visitors. Real ecology, with its messy predator-prey dynamics and its disease cycles and its unpredictable disturbances, was the enemy. The picture postcard version of nature was the goal. The wolf extermination program is worth pausing on because it shows just how committed the early parks were to engineering the landscape rather than preserving it. Between 1914 and 1926, the United States government, working through the Bureau of Biological Survey and the National Park Service, paid hunters to kill every single wolf inside Yellowstone National Park. The last known wolf pack was killed in 1926. The same thing was done in Glacier, in Yosemite, in Grand Canyon, and in every other large park where wolves had survived. Mountain lions were hunted aggressively. Coyotes were poisoned by the tens of thousands. The official reason was that these predators were killing the elk and the deer that tourists came to photograph. The deeper reason was that the parks were being run as outdoor zoos where the visible animals were the product, and any creature that interfered with the product was a pest. The result was an ecological disaster that took decades to fully understand. Without wolves, the elk populations exploded. The elk overgrazed the willows and the aspens along the rivers. Without willows and aspens, the beavers had nothing to build dams with. Without beaver dams, the streams ran faster and eroded their banks. Without healthy streams, the trout populations collapsed. An entire ecosystem unraveled because the federal government had decided that tourists wanted to see big mammals and not big predators. When wolves were finally reintroduced to Yellowstone in 1995, the recovery was so dramatic that ecologists invented a new term for it. They called it a trophic cascade. The willows came back, the beavers came back, the streams stabilized, but it took 70 years and the damage in some areas is still permanent. Hetch Hetchy is the other story you should know. In 1913, after years of political fighting, Congress passed a bill that allowed the city of San Francisco to build a dam inside Yosemite National Park. The dam flooded the entire Hetch Hetchy Valley, which John Muir himself had described as a second Yosemite Valley, just as beautiful as the famous one. Muir fought the dam for almost a decade. He lost. The valley was flooded in 1923. It is still flooded today. And the most disturbing part of the story is that the same Congress that was creating new parks was also drowning a piece of an existing one. The lesson is that the park system was never absolute. It was always a negotiation, and when use mattered enough to the right people, protection lost. It took the United States Park Service decades to start unwinding some of these decisions. Wolves weren't reintroduced to Yellowstone until 1995, and the reintroduction was deeply controversial. Bear feeding wasn't fully ended until the 1970s. Native peoples weren't formally consulted on park management until even later, and many tribes are still fighting for treaty rights inside park boundaries. The parks today are slowly, painfully, learning to be actual ecological reserves rather than just outdoor theme parks. But the institutional inheritance from the railroad era is still everywhere, in the road system, in the hotel locations, in the hierarchy of which species are protected and which are managed, in the assumption that the parks exist for human visitors first and ecosystems second. So the next time someone tells you that the national parks are America's best idea, pause for a moment and ask whose idea they actually were. The answer is not John Muir. The answer is not Theodore Roosevelt. The answer is a banker named Jay Cooke who needed customers for a railroad that ran through nothing. The answer is a corporate marketing strategy that turned land nobody wanted into a product everyone wanted. The answer is a quiet partnership between certain industrialists and certain conservationists, who each thought they were using the other and who together created something neither one of them could have created alone. The national parks are real. The geysers really do erupt. The canyons really are stunning. The wildlife really is irreplaceable. None of this is fake. But the story of how the parks came to exist is not the story you were taught in school. The real story involves railroad executives, financial panics, displaced tribes, corporate marketing, exterminated predators, and a national myth that was carefully constructed to obscure all of it. Understanding this doesn't ruin the parks. If anything, understanding this should make you a more careful and more honest visitor. When you stand at the rim of the Grand Canyon, you are standing in a place that was preserved partly because the Santa Fe Railway needed a destination. When you watch Old Faithful erupt, you are watching a spectacle that was kept intact because the Northern Pacific needed customers. The beauty is real, but the framework around the beauty is commercial, political, and contested. It always has been. And if America is going to have a more honest relationship with these places in the future, it's going to have to start by being more honest about how they came to exist in the first place. Not as a divine gift from far-sighted leaders, not as a triumph of nature over greed, but as a complicated, often ugly, sometimes inspiring product of a particular moment in American capitalism. A moment when the railroads needed something to sell, and found it in the wilderness. That's the real story of the national parks, and now you know it. If this video opened your eyes to a piece of American history you'd never heard before, do me a favor. Hit subscribe. We're going to keep digging into the corporate origins of things you thought you understood. Next week, we're breaking down the surprising business reason behind the creation of public schools in America. The answer is not what you were taught. Click the video on screen now to keep going.